Okay, the reason I'm going to review just a little bit of something we may have talked about, that we did talk about last time, is to bring us up to speed on a major transformation that takes place in the colonial era prior to the French and Indian War. It's a major transformation. Now, the other part of this is to let you know of the different names that are applied to all of these different conflicts. When you start looking at the histories, you'll find yourself coming up with Castin's War, and you think, well, who the heck was Castin, and what war was that? Or Father Bowdoin's War, or the first intercolonial war, or the first or second Indian War, and you'll start finding all these terms thrown around, and it causes utter confusion for most people when we start doing it, much like the names of various Native American tribes. You'll find different spellings, different pronunciations, different locations for them depending on the era. It just becomes a hodgepodge, a mess, trying to figure out. Part of what I'm trying to do, therefore, is to simplify it so we can follow a thread, but also at the same time have us understand the enormous complexity, all the different things that are happening during this era, that are happening not just here in North America, but are happening in Europe. I deliberately stayed away from introducing anything happening in Europe other than the names of particular conflicts, because those conflicts by themselves are enormously complicated and difficult to ferret out. It doesn't help us understand what's happening here in North America. The other point that I've emphasized is to put away our modern mindset and think of ourselves, because we have that kind of background, as colonists living in that era. What was the background they had? What were their attitudes, cultures, and societies like? All of which I've emphasized on a number of different occasions, even in different lectures. But if you cannot put aside a particular modern attitude towards things, a lot of this, complex as it is, becomes completely incomprehensible and therefore subject to your own particular personal judgment as to who was right, who was wrong, and so on and so forth. And I've tried to address some of that in reviewing Native American history, because in that context, much of what we've been exposed to, even if you grew up as I did, watching cowboys and Indians and things of that sort, we see the transformation over how people view Native Americans with an understandable degree of compassion and respect, but at the same time, completely take out of context what was going on at the time. So there's all of that. The other thing I want to mention is if you look up, use whatever search engine you want, between 1650 to 1750, look at the development of universities and colleges in North America. And you'll be astounded at how many there are that were established, including Moravia College, which had a boys' college and a girls' college. All right, something most of us would never have thought of. And if you really want to get into the weeds and look at the curricula, you realize that while many of these were set up as theologically based, what they introduced into those educational systems was an intense study of Latin, Greek, the classics to be read in their original language, plus many of the political scholars stemming from England and France, and some of the historians that had put together information which led to their whole understanding of their culture and attitudes. Add to that the legal systems. I'm not talking about the political governmental systems. I'm talking about the legal systems and how various rights were defined within the various political organizations that were established. Okay? So keep these things in mind. Otherwise, the confusion gets even worse. Here's an example. The Anglo-Abenaki Wars goes back to King Philip's War and then covers all of these up to this point. Now, I'm going to start us with a very quick review of King William's War, because King Philip's War took place in 1675, 1676, and we've already covered that. Now, this is from 1688 to 1697. Not a short war. When we think about modern warfare, putting aside things like Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam and so on, most wars conclude after about 5 years, ballpark figure, okay? At that point, most of the combatants are tired out. Now, these are not constant combats, of course. In fact, there are no serious major battles that occur, but what is particularly important about this conflict is listed in this second line. French and British regulars fight each other. For the first time in North America, regular army troops confront each other. There have been French support for Indians, and they were not until we dealt with the first iteration of when French troops were actually sent to suppress the Iroquois, but they did not confront the British. And the British, similarly, in that first iteration, did not have any regular soldiers. But here they do. This is a step up in the escalation, it's almost a redundancy, of the conflicts that are going to develop between France and England that are eventually going to end up in the French and Indian War, as we call it. Now, after they battle each other, they end up with the Treaty of Ryswick, and it basically says, well, nice to fight, but we're going back to the way things were in the beginning. It's not quite like Korea, but it involves the kind of tacit understanding, we're tired, this isn't worth continuing beyond this particular time. Now, during this so-called war, and this is not something that starts with a declaration of war, but it does end with a treaty, which is why it can be called that, takes place during a period of time in which England is undergoing enormous transformation. The so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 finds the English monarch James II dispossessed of his throne, and it's turned over to William of Orange and King James' daughter, Mary II, and they establish what we could call maybe the first real constitutional monarchy, where the monarch's authority is somewhat restricted. Now, George II and George III will change that. Yes?
Where did they battle each other in North America? What's the location?
Primary location was up through Newfoundland.
Oh, okay.
And then they actually, Phips, P-H-I-P-S, actually went to Quebec and confronted the French general there, Frontenac, who was also the governor, and called on him to surrender. But there was actual fighting among the troops at different locations, so there weren't these out-and-out battles that'll come to the fore later on. And Frontenac at that point, when Phips was there, having come up the St. Lawrence, said, we're not surrendering, go home. And Phips did. Now, during the course of this, I do want to mention that there were a whole series of raids that took place as well. And these raids often were at local settlements, killing inhabitants, looting settlements, and taking prisoners. And we've talked about what happened to a lot of them. One place was Schenectady. If you go up just not too far from here, you can look for Fort Schenectady and you can read some of the history there. But a lot of this took place in this New England region and in North America. Now, just to mention Schenectady, 114 French soldiers and militiamen, 96 Mohawk and Algonquin warriors attacked Schenectady. 60 residents were killed, including 11 slaves. 60 residents were spared. Many of the ones who were spared were taken as prisoners, and we've talked about what happens to them later on. And then this particular conflict was finally halted with that treaty, as I mentioned. This is just an example of the maneuvers that took place. And what we can see in the blue is where there were different movements by French forces in blue and by the British forces in red. Now, at the conclusion, the tensions between France and England have this almost sine curve-like relationship. Parts where they have peace, parts where they're in tension with each other, and then at the bottom of that wave where they're actually fighting each other. But what is the situation in 1700 that makes this King William's War such a dramatic transformation in relationships? And it's partly expressed in this slide showing the location of French forts. And if you look at the slide in blue, which is the French holdings, and you look at these star shapes, these are the forts that the French had created, in part for trading, so they could continue the fur trade and other things which they wanted to get from Native Americans. But it also constrained the movement of English settlers from the coastland inland. And this, in a sense, was seen as a real problem for the British because they knew there was a lot of land out there, but somehow they were fearful the French would shut this off. And notice that down in Mobile, Biloxi, Pensacola, and so on is right at the base of the Mississippi River as well. A key place for transformation of goods, which, if push came to shove in the Northeast with the British Navy, you still had an exit going out to the south. The reason I show this slide is why these forts really constituted a barrier. The Appalachian Mountains, if you go through them at all, strip away the roads you're on, strip away any modernity at all. If you want an example, it's relatively easy. Go down to our river. Look at our river, strip away the buildings. Think of those mountains and the forests and so on. These are very difficult to traverse going from east to west. It's not an easy journey. So if the English found themselves trapped not only by the mountains, but because of the logistical requirements of maintaining a force on the other side, it wouldn't take much for the French to keep them from expanding. And remember, the population in the colonies is rising dramatically. So keep this part in mind. Now, these are some of the different conflicts that are going to take place up to the beginning of the French-Indian War. And I've highlighted what's going on in Europe for a couple of them. And we'll talk about all of these somewhat briefly today, take us up to the actual conflict. This is what North America looked like in 1702. Notice the following. British territory, very strictly confined, but with a population that is far beyond that of the French and the Spanish. So as you crowd people into a territory, what's the natural reaction? Especially because the immigrants are coming from Europe and primarily from England, almost exclusively at this time frame. Why did they come? Because once they finished their indenture, if that's how they were brought, or if they were supported by a various company that was going to buy land and sell land as a way of making a profit, there was an opportunity for you who had no access to property in England could have property here. And once you had property, what did that mean? As an Englishman, and I'll make it fairly easy to understand, my home is my castle. You don't come in without my permission, okay? That kind of sentiment was very prevalent and increasing for another reason. As the colonies were established, it was very clear that they had to govern their area. And the royal governor, who was sent to handle the top perch of that governing body, had to have counsel with the inhabitants. So legislatures of various sorts were set up. And through those legislatures, the English who were residing here would have conversations about what kind of laws they wished to have. The royal governor might have some sort of veto power, but if the decision is made that he is not behaving himself, and that's why I showed you Bacon's Revolution in Jamestown, the idea is enough is enough. We're here. This is our land. And if you don't show respect for us and do the things you're supposed to do, then we will get rid of you. And it took sending troops from England to suppress that in order to shut Bacon down. But that is an example of what is beginning to permeate the colonies well before the American Revolution. Yes, we're going to listen to England, but that doesn't mean we kneel before England. Immigrants are beginning to see themselves as, we might call it, American English, as opposed to American Dutch or American French, okay? But the attitudes are changing. You see the extent of territory. Now, the other reason I point this out is for the following. As you are aware, in colonies that are being established around the world during this period of time, the actual presence of the French in what looks to be a large area is really incredibly low. So how do they claim this? Well, they go back to Europe and they said, we've laid out the following area that belongs to us. And the British say, well, I don't know about that, you know, and that's where you have a lot of the other conflict coming up. Because if you can't defend this territory, it'll be taken from you, right? That's already happened to many Native Americans. That's why you have this British territory and these French areas that are under their control. I don't care if you think it's yours. If you cannot defend it, it's not. Now, I'm going to jump a little bit to modernity for this following reason. We hear of countries saying they are neutral, correct? Switzerland, good example. Before Finland and Sweden particularly joined NATO, they were neutral, okay? But there's a specific definition of neutrality. You can't just simply say, I'm neutral. You have to show an ability to defend your borders. You can resist incursion. If you can't demonstrate that, your neutrality means nothing. Okay? Keep that in mind, because that's also a part of what we're seeing here. The War of Spanish Succession is what really led to what we call Queen Anne's War, because she was the reigning monarch at the time. And it was fought primarily in Acadia and the St. Lawrence borderlands that you see in the far right portion of this slide, where you see a lot of that reddish color and blue. And during this particular conflict, again, the British made some serious inroads against the French, particularly in Acadia. The war was finally concluded with the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. But the Treaty of Utrecht did not really embrace what was happening in North America, at least in a critical sense, because the Native Americans who'd been involved in all of this were kind of left out of the treaty altogether. It's like, well, this is between Britain and France and the other countries involved in Spanish succession, Spain and so on. You guys don't really matter, okay? Oops. How well will that sit with them? Not very. So what happens is the English in particular say, you know something, we better deal with this. So a treaty is set up at Portsmouth in 1713 with England and just the Wabanaki. Now again, this is where things get to be very confusing, because you have Wabanaki, Abenaki, they're pretty much the same issue. But that's what I mean when you start reading this history. You begin to start scratching your head. Is this a different confederation? Is this a different tribe? Who are these people? And how do the British deal with them? And that indeed emphasizes, here we are, 200 years later, 300 years later, and we can't get the names right. What do you think the British were confronting, or the French? You think it was any easier for them? Think of how a slight change in your language and your pronunciation suddenly makes the identification complicated. Are you Abenaki or Wabanaki? I don't have a spelling, right? It's all phonetic. And with my old ears, maybe I heard an A as an E or something of that sort, or as an I as a Y. So when I wrote it down, I ended up with this hodgepodge of names. And then you're talking to the various Native Americans. Well, they don't have a written language. And they look at yours and say, I don't know what this is all about. Have you ever tried translating something? Okay? It is extremely difficult to get the nuances right, particularly if the fundamental assumptions are differing. So this is something that's going on every moment of the time that they're there, trying to figure it out. The Treaty of Utrecht, and I show this because of the following reason. France and England look pretty much the same color, except for this misery up in Scotland that relates to the Jacobite uprising that occurred in 1715. That was an attempt, if I recall correctly, to restore James back to the throne. But notice the so-called Holy Roman Empire in Prussia, that's all a mess. And there's another map that demonstrates it even further. When you look at a map of the Holy Roman Empire, a blow-up map, there are so many principalities with such vague borders. It's just incomprehensible. You could spend your life trying to figure that out. Now, the Anglo-Abenaki Wars, I hope I went in the right direction. This just gives you an idea of the time frame of what we're talking about. We've just finished with number 3, Queen Anne's War. Now, this is the basic issue of the Treaty of Utrecht as it relates to North America. And that is that the British got control of Acadia. Okay? they had to give up territories that they had taken from the French, but they had established themselves pretty solidly in that area. And this has importance because we're all very familiar with the exile of the Acadians that happens a bit later in time. So after Queen Anne's War, there's now a transformation. Noticed in red, territory ceded by France to Great Britain. Notice that it's in Canada around Hudson Bay. You have a portion of Acadia, Newfoundland region, that's taken over. And the French territory is getting a little compressed as the British colonies have also pushed their borders out during this particular conflict. So they've been expanding. If you look back to 1702, you'll see a cutoff in British territory through Pennsylvania and Virginia and so on. Who are the Wabanaki or the Abenaki? And you can see that I've even changed the spelling periodically. The reason I show this is that there was a confederation. It was looser than the confederation that existed among the Iroquois. But there was another important element because they lacked political cohesion. The British said, who's the leader? I mean, that's what we're used to. You got to have a leader. And somebody would step up and say, well, I'm the leader. Okay, maybe of this house, or maybe of this settlement, but not necessarily of the entire tribe. Well, the British would then say, oh, good, we'll sit down and talk to you, and we'll figure out what we can do about settling the conflicts that exist between the Native American, your tribe, and our settlers. Oh, okay, we'll agree. But that didn't necessarily bind any of the other tribes. Well, now think, you have to go out and make an agreement with each and every tribe? Nah, you'll sign, you'll be responsible for it. And this is how we're going to control the interactions between our two societies. How well do these truces last? Well, I've already laid the groundwork, not very long. So what happens? Well, in 1717, as I mentioned, Governor Shute and the Wabanaki reach an agreement. And the Kennebec session, you know, the Kennebec River up in Maine, right? He says, okay, I'll agree if you set up this particular boundary and hold it intact. Shute's response, and it'll sound aggressive, in some ways it is, we desire only what is our own, and that we will have. So in this situation, that's the steel fist in the velvet glove. We have the power and authority to do this. You have agreed. We'll only take what is ours, whatever those settlements are, but we will definitely have it. And that implies something else. If you raid our settlements, then we will retaliate. And we have the means to do so. So, on the one hand, you can take it with a good flavor. What's ours is ours. But if you try to do anything to us as a result, then we will respond. Well, you've got a burgeoning English population coming in. It doesn't take long. They start settling across the border. Now you're a Native American tribe. You guys agreed not to do this. Get out of here. I ain't leaving. Come and make me. Okay. So what do? You start raiding, and then pretty soon the settlers say, you know something, they just burned down Joe's house and killed his family and looted his farm and butchered his animals, and we're not going to stand for that. So pretty soon you start raiding and counter-raiding. That's not to absolve the English of any responsibility, but I want you to put yourself in the mindset. You're a settler across that river, is some fertile ground, I can set a farm up there. Those people who think it's theirs can only hold it if they hold it by force. And if they don't have the force, I'm not going to respect that. But then you go across the river and get yourself killed, all right? Well, you do that, then pretty soon there's going to be some reaction. So pretty soon, larger colonial forces are brought together to deal with it. And they really get into it. Now, I showed this for the following reason. First is that even in 1724, this depiction shows the Native Americans to be as we have interpreted them to be for the whole time that we've been in North America, from 1608 on and so on. But I want to point out something else. Note the tail, actually on two warriors, okay? It's propaganda. These are evil, okay? Now, why do you make that determination? Because we've seen what they've done to the settlers. We've heard reports of what they've done to prisoners. You cannot reason with these people. So you depict them as this. But notice also that you don't see any guns, and this is 1724. They're still relying heavily on Native American weaponry, and it's effective. So the raiding goes on. Now notice that it's Micmac, which is a sub-tribe of the Wabanaki Confederation. Lieutenant Governor Drummond, Massachusetts, joins together with Doucette and Lovewell, They put together substantial forces. But here's the other critical element that often gets forgotten in colonial history. Notice that the native tribes are led not just by a native chieftain, Chief Greylock and Chief Paugus, but Father Sebastian Rao, Jesuit. So he's as much in this mix and involved in the raiding as anybody. Does that grant him particular, we'll call it Geneva Convention-like treatment if he's captured? Well, not only did the Geneva Convention not exist, but the answer is no. So this begins to increase the tensions, not just between New France and the colonies, but also begins to raise the temperature between England and France. Now, as far as they're concerned, still, despite the presence of regular British and French troops that had come to the North American area, the French government and the English government regarded North America sort of a proxy war, right? We can feed some resources in, but we really don't want to get involved ourselves because the conflict between France and England carries devastating complications with it. As a result, there's a particular raid or series of raids. The reason that date is there is for the following. Many of the settlements that the colonists raided were actually ambushed as they approached those settlements. Many were killed. They finally created a large campaign up the Kennebec and Penobscot, and they found at one of the settlements, Father Rao was there, and they killed him. And in 1726, both sides had really had enough. This is a depiction of Father Rao. When you look at that, if all you saw was the image, you would think, why does he deserve that? Here's a guy who's a religious missionary. He's trying to convert people to the Catholic faith, and he's butchered. Well, except he was leading some of these raids that were going on. And in fact, there's another set of conflicts with another Jesuit. As that concludes, what we see now, a number of years later, is an emphasis on Acadia. Now, the reason this is particularly important is because, as you'll see in the top right corner, if you want to get to the St. Lawrence, and you have a base, especially a naval base that you've set up in Acadia, that this becomes an important place for you to be able to send ships up and take care of blocking entrance to the St. Lawrence. If you block that, then all of the French colonies, all the way to the Mississippi, are going to struggle to get supplies, and you've intercepted the trade. So Acadia becomes particularly important to the English, especially over time. I blow up this map to show you basically the trade routes in red that France relies upon. And the primary base for the French Navy, such as it is, will be at Louisbourg, where they build a substantial fort. Now, Louisbourg has changed hands every now and then, but it's always been given back to the French during the course of treaties and different other agreements. But things are going to move ahead now, and they're going to reach a different level of challenge to France as we see what goes on later on. Now, I mentioned this because of the overlap, but if the War of Jenkins, and I misspelled that, there's only one N, I'll have to fix that. Jenkins here. Jenkins was a British sea captain, a little bit of a nefarious character. He had been doing some semi-legal, probably some very illegal trading down in the region of the Caribbean where the Spanish were in charge, and he was stopped. And on one occasion in well before 1739, when he returned to England, said they had cut off my ear. And the British Parliament at the time, government, said, that's on you for doing what you shouldn't have been doing. And you would have thought that would have been the end of it. But remember what I said is happening in North America. Tensions are rising, and the French and English have been engaged with regular military forces, at least on one occasion, and perhaps on others that were not quite rising to the level of an out-and-out fight, but enough that both governments are beginning to be concerned. And on top of it, Acadia basically allows the British, who hold most of it, to block the entrance to the St. Lawrence. So things begin to escalate, and finally, war breaks out. And in the war breaking out, again, one of those complex, crazy European conflicts with different groups in and out at different times, there ends up to be a fair amount of fighting called King George's War over a 4-year period of time in North America, because George II was the monarch at the time. And here's one of the most notable occurrences that takes place. Massachusetts Governor Shirley, who shows a fair amount of military competence, goes up and takes on the French fortress at Louisbourg. Now remember, I showed you on the other slide the importance of Louisbourg as a French port and controlling a lot of the ingress and egress to the St. Lawrence. So when this happens, the major conflict that takes place is at the Louisbourg fortress. Different allies join with the British or the French, but they're becoming less and less critical as major forces and becoming more important as scouts and attempts to wean other native tribes that are on the opposite side away from support for that particular French or British group. But more and more also, these tribes are forced to take sides in a way that they didn't have to before. When it was militia and settlers and things of that sort, you could really play the French and the British off against each other. But here it's becoming increasingly difficult, partly because of the expansion of English settlements, much larger than the French settlements, but importantly also because they're now encroaching on your land more and more. And what are you going to do to resist that? This becomes a real issue down the road. This is just an example, a map of how the British went up to take Louisburg. And the other part I want to notice to this is through May and half of June, 6 weeks, this siege continues. This same approach, almost identical, is used in the French and Indian War. Just an example, but it just gets to show you the movement that takes place. Now, distances are not huge. The legend down there is more in feet, and it's 2,000 feet from the left side to the right side. But the importance of it is that this threatens a major hold that the French must control in order to maintain access to the St. Lawrence. So over time, Louisburg is finally captured, and the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, again returns Louisburg back to the French. Now, think of it this way. Not only were there regular British troops and naval troops involved in taking Louisburg, but there was a lot of colonial militia. You've taken probably the most important French fortress, controlling access to the St. Lawrence. And over there in Europe, they say you got to give it all back. Have we been down that road before? Kind of doesn't work well for you. And because of that, there's more and more tension between the, I'm going to call them Americans at this point, because it's easier to distinguish the levels, the attitudes that are rising up considerably and going to lead to some considerable fallout later on. So in terms of this, the Americans say, you're going back to the way things were before? That doesn't work. Well, we over here in England are in charge. So get with the program. Okay. Yes?
How did the War of Jenkins' Ear manifest in North America?
The British, once they began to run into conflicts with Spain over trade agreements and issues like that, re-energized Jenkins' Ear and worked on creating a propaganda, if you will, to increase support and basically say, look what happened back 10 years ago. The Spaniards board a British ship and they abused the British captain and cut off his ear, and now all these abuses, because we didn't do anything about it, are simply escalating. Think of it as what some people talk about, the broken window approach to policing. You broke a window. We'll let it go, right? Well, what's next? A couple of broken windows. What's next? Well, you see, now there's some vandalism. So it escalates. That's the theory. So the British use that as part. Yes?
I'm thinking about this Louisburg thing. The British had de facto control of Louisburg. Why would they surrender? Is France in some way associated with that Treaty of Austrian Succession?
Yeah, and this gets back to why I've ignored dealing what's going on in Europe. But yes, indeed, the French and the British are on different sides. The fighting that's going on over in Europe is intense.
Well, why give it back to France?
Because Britain got some other things as a result. Some trading agreements. They, for example, I hate to say it, but it's true, they were given certain permission to bring as many as 5,000 Africans to the colonies in the Caribbean, mostly to the Caribbean, interestingly, when you look up the slave trade and how it impacted North America and so on. To bring in 5,000 African Americans to the Caribbean and North America as labor force. Prior to this, the Spanish had been primarily in control of it. So all of these things end up with these subtle ramifications, and the British, seeing that there was a great profit to be made, and because they lacked labor, which was necessary, particularly in the South, because of the development of tobacco, primarily tobacco, not cotton yet. That was going to come. But that's labor intensive, and English immigrants, as we've said here in the United States, they don't want to do those jobs, right? Well, if I'm going to grow tobacco, I've got to have labor. Bring me slaves. That's my labor.
Or sugar cane.
In the Caribbean and other things, exactly. But I'm referring this primarily to North America, but Robert is exactly correct. The value of trade is extraordinary. And in answer to a person's question, I don't know if I sent it out. If I haven't, I will. That shows the growth in the British merchant fleet from 1600 up to about 1750.
Yes.
Did I send that out?
Yes.
Okay. Look at that. It's amazing. The number of ships, the tonnage, the amount of cargo is extraordinary. So if you start cutting into your ability to get resources from North America and the Caribbean and bring those resources home where you can take those resources and convert them into finished products, which you can sell not just back to North America, which is a nice market, but to sell around the world, is a huge impact, okay? You need that money if you're going to keep running a government and you're going to benefit the people under your authority, okay? This problem is still with us today. I'm going to take just a tangent for a moment. The status right now of the American merchant fleet is that it's almost non-existent. Most all of our trade is carried out by ships operating under other flags of registry. So our ability to control our trade with our ships right now is deemed such a danger that in the previous administrations, not just the current one, but more heavily emphasized in the current administration, is to get shipbuilding going again here in the United States. Otherwise, we're dependent on all these others. Like it or not is not the issue. The issue is that's where we are. That was same here. So England was willing to make concessions. And for the French, they're saying, we must have Louisburg back or we lose control of the St. Lawrence, you see? So that's a no-brainer as far as they're concerned.
That's British.
The British said, we'll give it up if you give us the trade concessions, and this is all three ways of dealing, right? I could offer current modern examples of how you deal with this guy to deal with that guy to get what you want, okay? And that's kind of the nature of the beast of international politics. And this is extremely complicated international politics. Oh, another Jesuit. Notice the different names again. Micmac War, Anglo-Micmac War, so on and so on and so on. 1749 to 55, 6 years this goes on. Again, these aren't formal European-style battles. There are campaigns, but the campaigns largely revolve around destroying settlements, except Acadia becomes a real focal point. And because of what happens in Acadia, where you see an estimated 2,500 Micmac and 12,000 Acadians, that's the population, not the number of warriors and soldiers or militia, all right? The British, Edward Cornwallis, I think he's the granduncle of the guy who surrenders at Yorktown. Okay, that's my rough. He's not his actual grandfather. He might be just an uncle. Anyway, he goes up there with British authority. The charge from the British government is establish a base. Right? We don't have Louisburg, but we need a naval base. So go create it. He creates Halifax. He erects them in 1749, and then he builds some other ones that you see listed in different locations to reestablish and consolidate British authority. Now, this is a little bit of a divergence, but I want to point out something by showing this slide. This fellow Broussard fought with the French for nearly 40 years. This guy fought from, I think, roughly 1720-ish, Drummond's War that I showed you, 1722. He wasn't very old at the time, but he was 20. And he fought all the way up into the French and Indian War. Okay. So this guy was also helping as a leader to raid, and particularly I brought this up because they attacked Dartmouth. We're at Dartmouth Colleges right now. Or no, I'm near there, not in Hanover, but it's near Dartmouth. You're looking at me funny, Robert.
Okay. I didn't think they had gotten that far south.
20 settlers mutilating men, women, children, babies, took others prisoner. These are the reports from not the survivors necessarily, but the people who went there after it was all done. So the point I'm making is that the brutality continued. There was no age discrimination. There were no protected people. You went into a settlement, you killed anybody you want. Now again, I'm not saying this is necessarily the fault, but in the long history that we've gone through with Native American culture, we realized that that was a normal mode of action. Okay? So, yes?
Did the British respond to the French settlers in a similar way with similar brutality?
They sure did. Yep. Because their point was, you want to fight? We'll fight. We'll fight on your terms. This is that old idea. And again, I'm diverging, but I want to just emphasize these points because when we ask ourselves about today and what's going on, what's one of the words for those of you who are interested in military history, goes on about the kind of warfare that is happening. We call it asymmetric warfare. Okay? Take Afghanistan, take Iraq as examples. It was true to a degree even in Vietnam. We kept certain gloves on because we were trying to win the hearts and minds of people. And I won't go down that road as to whether that's a good thing or not. It's not the part of this conversation. But back then, they said, screw that idea. You want to fight this way? We'll fight that way. It's that old fight fire with fire. In Europe, it was different. And I had referenced that with the Treaty of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War. And I had referenced even back to the year 1000 or 990, roughly, with the so-called Peace of God that was established by Pope Urban. Leave the innocents alone. Don't go in there and kill all their livestock and brutalize the families. You guys want to fight? Go fight each other, you knights and aristocrats. That's what you like to do? Go do it. But by the way, Sunday is off limits. Okay, just as an example. So Cornwallis goes up and he establishes a government. Notice an executive and legislative council. Who constitutes those people? Not the English government in England. He has to use locals. But he also sets up the following things. So when we tend to demonize the British or the Americans or whatever in what's happening in North America, we have to go back to our mindset. What was life like in the 1700s? What were you used to? And if you were going to constitute a body politic, how was it organized? It's not organized according to tribal systems. We're using our system, which has hundreds of years of tradition behind it. So he sets up a constitution, law courts, public school for orphans, religious diversity. Very interesting that he's willing to do that when the religious wars had always, up until the Treaty of Westphalia, at the end of the 30 Years' War, had denounced religious diversity. In fact, many of the early American colonies denounced religious diversity. Okay? Roger Williams getting expelled as a result. I think he went to Rhode Island, right?
Hooker's party.
Yep. First, Jewish, German, and Protestant communities, and the first Protestant dissenting congregation in Canada, because Canada had been primarily Catholic, right? Now he's establishing control, and he's saying, okay, at this level, we can allow these different religions to live together. Except, there's always an exception. Cornwallis becomes aware, if he wasn't already, just in terms of the conflict, that Acadians had fought against, I'll call it the British forces. And in doing so, he's saying, now what am I going to do with these people? How about Gaza? Right? Those of you who came to that Friday session. What do you do with a group that has fought against you and on top of it has a different core religion and a different historical allegiance to another country? So he gives them a choice. We control this area. You have to reject Catholicism and accept the Anglican Church. Is that going to fly? Remember, 1700s, you're Catholic. That means something. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't mean something today. I won't go down that path. All right? Yep, stop doing that. Stop doing that. So he says, listen, I have to set up forts because I control this area, and this is the charge given to me by the British government. The Acadians say, oh, I don't like that. That's the steel glove now, the steel fist. I don't see the velvet glove here. And he says, tough. You supported French policy, so I'm kicking a whole bunch of people out, and I'm going to confiscate your lands, and who's going to get your lands? New immigrants. Where are they coming from? England. The Micmac remember, there were 2,500 Micmac living in that area. We're going to deal with them in a different fashion. And this is where there are different legal things that happen. Now, we ask ourselves, why do you need to change your legal basis for dealing with the Micmac? Where does that come from? And why do you need that basis at all? Why don't you just do what you're going to do regardless? Because the institution of law sets down boundaries and guidelines. And it broadens them or narrows them. Remember, all laws draw a bright line. Here's okay, here's not okay. Technically, if you're on the highway and the speed limit's 65 and you go 66, you've broken the law. Okay? What happens? Treat them as British subjects. That changes things dramatically. We'll take a break in just a moment. Okay, no, that's all right. In their opinion, to declare war formally against the Micmac Indians would be a manner to own them a free and independent people. Lincoln never recognized Jefferson Davis as the legitimate government head of the Confederacy. Why? Because if he does that, then he's acknowledged their independence, and this becomes truly a war of aggression. If he doesn't, it's a war of rebellion against the national government. And that changes the legal issues that surround all kinds of other ramifications. Treat them as so many banditti, ruffians, or rebels to His Majesty's government, which puts them on the real danger of execution. Okay? Once you are in rebellion, then you have separated yourself from the legal framework that exists for England. And that's what's going to happen when you get to the American Revolution. Okay? So finally, just to finish this up, they issue a proclamation exiling them, authorizing command to all officers, civil and military, to annoy, distress, take, or destroy the savage commonly called Micmac, wheresoever they are to be found, and as such as aiding and assisting them. And then they give this bounty. 10 guinea is a lot of money back then. Micmac taken or killed to be paid upon produce in such savage taken, or his scalp, as in the custom of America. Because this had been the French doing it as well. We pay a bounty. You don't bring us a body, bring us a live officer, bring us a scalp, we'll pay you X, Y, and Z. All right, just to continue this little bit, the War of Jenkins Ear, properly spelled, takes place almost exclusively in the Caribbean region. The ramifications for North America have to do with a change in the slave trade. More than anything else will have its effect on the colonies and their growth and development. And this just shows some of the European holdings that existed in that region, split up among the French, British, and to some extent still the Dutch and the Spanish. Okay, let's take a break. If you have questions, feel free to come up and ask me. To just finish up that last bit on Acadia, you can see that from the British standpoint, they say these people who are here, these Acadians, they just can't be trusted. And the only way to deal with them is to have them truly and completely convert to the British side, which means an oath to the British government and to its religion. That's the crux of the matter for the Acadians, or you're out of here. So when you depopulate that area, you no longer have them as an issue. They're gone. Don't have to fuss with them anymore. okay? All right. I mentioned this because Georgia was an English colony, but you notice where the border, the boundary is, but you'll see how different claims extend all the way over to the Mississippi. And there's conflicts that arise without the kind of severity between Spain and the English settlements there. I mentioned that at St. Simon's Island, just off the coast of Georgia, right near Florida, there was a Spanish attempt to drive the English out. The Spanish had been in St. Augustine since the 1500s. I forget the exact date. It might have been something like 1583 or something of that sort. And so they headed north, but they were defeated by the English. Now, how do you establish these claims? And who's responsible for defining the borders? Well, this is, again, part of the enormous complexity that's taking place within the British Empire in particular. You may have heard of the East India Company as an example. There was the Hudson Bay Company. And other organizations established initially in England sent to these far out places where the English had established their claims. And these companies actually often had their own military. And they would expand their influence. Now, as they expanded their influence, they would go back to the crown and say, we need a royal charter giving us authority to own this land and sell it to new settlers. Now, if you're selling it and you're in England and you don't have access to land, and somebody says you can get 100 acres or whatever, or 1,000 acres for this price, then would you take it? Oh boy, if I have the money, absolutely. I'm going where I can have land. So all of this stuff, as you'll see, beginning 1787, that's obviously when the Constitution was designed, but all the way through 1732, the boundary extends all the way to here. Now, there aren't any English out there, okay? It's not like they've got cities or settlements. They just laid claim to it. And within the European system of organization of authority, that meant that the French, if they went into that area, could be told to leave. Why is this important? Because this is going to happen in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Now, I talked about this before a bit, and I want to re-emphasize because it really comes down to a major transformation that has been developing from King William's War, 1688, all the way up to now, and has the seeds within it to utterly transform the relationships between the colonies and the home country. These take on a very different nature. This war is going to be fought primarily with European people, militia, provincials, regular army. They have different names for them in in Canada, but we're not going to go there. The Native Americans are helpful, but they are now nothing more than just auxiliaries. They can be very important, and their behavior will have a great influence on certain things that go on during this war. But the important element here is to understand that this is a real transformation in North America. Now, the first European war to go global. Prior conflicts had involved different naval battles in different locations around the world. There had been different limited contests of troops invasions of various islands, taking fortifications, giving them back, and things of that sort. Why does this one go global? If you look over here in the far right, they're in the Philippines. They're in Siam, Thailand. Burma area, Myanmar, as it's called nowadays. India. Okay? The Dutch East Indies. Fighting is going on all over the place. And in that sense, now, your geopolitical position as a government is transformed from just focus on Europe to the world at large. Now think of how that complicates all of the decisions you're called upon to make. Allocation of resources. Your resources are not infinite. You have to pick and choose what matters. Just as you have to pick and choose when you have a treaty, what you're willing to give up. So the important part to emphasize is that as far as the 13 colonies are concerned, going up all the way to the inlet to the St. Lawrence, the concentration of fighting is going to occur in the Northeast. We live in an area in this state, our political boundaries of the state, but we live in an area where much of this war is fought, and also down into Pennsylvania and part of Ohio. So you can travel around this state and find places where things actually happened. You don't have to go far. The other part is that the monarchical system in Europe is enormously complex. When you look at who's married to whom and whose daughter was this and who got that and so on, you end up throwing your hands up and thinking, holy mackerel, how do you keep track of this? And they actually had books that laid out all of these familial relationships so you could figure out not only who was who, but who had a particular advantage, say, in becoming a prince or becoming the king or the queen, things of that nature. So these are all intertwined. And for some of you, you may remember that at the outset of World War I, Queen Victoria had family members in Russia, in Germany, in England. Out of the same family? Yeah. Okay. As an example. And the transformation that will take place would be global. Now, this isn't a world war in the sense that China got involved or Japan got involved directly or India got involved, because India by then was still dealing with its own internal problems, which were huge. But it does encompass the world as a whole. So if we don't remember that, what's happening in North America becomes more difficult to understand. Keep it as a backdrop. Okay. As I said, the Far East was not exempt. Trade had expanded globally. And again, if you look at the information provided on British shipping, you begin to understand its importance. Notice that Europe, which now calls this the 7 Years' War, had a different series of issues that were important to it. The 7 Years' War in Europe, again, just as has been the case with European conflicts for centuries, is again enormously complex. But their interest there went more political than simply territorial, although territory was certainly a key issue. But the political issues had a great deal to drive them. This particular slide is just to show the complex area that's involved. Don't worry about the green. That's all the different Native American tribes that were present at roughly this time frame of 1750. But the idea behind it is that this region was also going to be an important area that would trigger this war. This just gives you an idea of the main scope. Now, I'm sorry about the way the slide presents itself, but the idea is that in different segments throughout this entire war, you can see that it's mostly confined to the Northeast, okay? Little things happened further south, but they had no major impact on the outcome. The outcome was established here. Now, one of the key issues that happened in 1754 was the French had realized the importance of the Ohio Valley, and they were now willing to commit real resources to securing it. Why was the Ohio Valley important? It was important for trade, but it also was the link through the Ohio River to the Mississippi, okay? And that allowed you, if necessary, to circumvent British interference to at least a degree. You still had to get out of the Gulf and you had to get through the Caribbean, or Caribbean, depending on how you like to pronounce it. But they began to establish serious forts that would gain control so that as this is all linked up and you come up the Ohio River, you can go up the Allegheny and then you have a portage which takes you up to Lake Ontario. And then from Lake Ontario, you can head out to the St. Lawrence. So they begin to do this. And the British get wind of it. Now, they've got to find a way to go tell the French, this is our land, not yours. You got to leave. So they got to find somebody to go lead that expedition. And they find a guy who had been a surveyor and had some connection to the region. And they said, listen, George, we'd like to hire you. You go on out there with this group and you tell the French at Fort Le Boeuf, here, right near Presque Isle, and then that lead up there. You go tell the French, you got to leave, this is British. So he trundles his way over there, and the French say, nah, go home. We're not interested. So he goes back, and I think it was Governor Dinwiddie who was in charge of Virginia at the time. And he says, they didn't buy it. He says, well, you go back out there, and you've told me in your report that there's a place where you could set up a fort that would control where the Ohio and the Monongahela and the Allegheny come together. He says, yeah, I can do that. So he starts on his way, but it turns out the French beat him, got there before he did. And they call it Fort Duquesne. So he goes up, and they meet him on his way, and he sets up this little supply fort. It's really not much of anything. Let me see if I have a picture of it. I'll go back. Yeah, there you are. Okay. And he says, you guys got to leave. And the French give him the same answer. Yeah, we're not leaving. In fact, when he goes back to Fort Necessity, they say, guess what, George? You get out of Dodge. We've got you surrounded, and you don't have enough force to stand. So things begin to deteriorate. Now, I'm going to jump ahead for a minute to just again show you something about the terrain, because in other lectures I've talked about the importance of terrain. I want you to realize just how mountainous this area is. Therefore, much of the campaigning will take place along river valleys. But the logistical support, if you're trying to cross these mountains, it's almost impossible. Becomes extremely difficult for you to be able to do anything. This is just another way of looking at it in terms of where much of the French and Indian War will be fought. I just circled the areas where the main conflicts will take place, as you can see. Right now, we're dealing with areas down through here, okay? All right. I should have shown you that sooner. Apologies. So what happens? Well, George goes back out once again after the governor tells him, you go tell the French that if they don't get out of there, we're sending a force which will drive you out. It says, your battery is running low. That's on this computer, Tom. Tom, this computer says the battery's running low. I don't want it to cut out on me, even though we've got a half hour to go. So what happens, yeah, once again, George goes back out there, and he wants to deliver this message, but now he's very wary of what's gone on. And as a result, he sends out a larger force than he had initially. And as he goes out to this region, he has some Indian allies with him, not a big group, just a bunch, to help guide and, you know, run ahead and see if they can spot the French coming at him and so on. Well, when he beds down at a place and he finds from his Indian scouts that there's this French group coming towards them. They've somehow been alerted that George Washington once again is showing up. Thank you. So Washington figures, we're going to go out and we're going to confront these guys. He hasn't really settled in his own mind just what's going to happen. But he goes out in the night in order to arrive at the French encampment early in the morning. And when he does, I'm sorry, this will help us understand where things are happening. Let's see. Yeah, okay, down in the lower portion. He's headed back out that route. He ends up surprising the French at this glen. And although this picture is not very accurate, they start shooting at the French. It's not clear, like Lexington, you know, who fires the first shot. But the end result is pretty clear. The French who are there suffer a number of casualties in the exchange of fire. 14 are dead and wounded. Washington had 3 wounded, 1 dead. One of the French who was wounded was this Joseph de Villiers, also known as Jumonville, who had connections to the French crown through some marriage. And he's badly wounded. And he has with him documents that he was to bring and tell the British once again, listen, this is our land. Let the governments in England and France work this out. Don't keep sending guys here to annoy us and threaten us, because we're not going to tolerate it. But Jumonville is injured badly, and the papers are produced, but Washington and his people don't speak French with any degree of competence. So they don't really understand what's going on. And one of the Indians who was there goes up to Jumonville and he utters a phrase in French about, "You are not dead yet," and then plunges a tomahawk into his skull and kills him. And a number of other wounded are executed in this literal bloodbath. So I made an error earlier on, and I apologize. This is an example of my losing my own track. The Fort Necessity had been set up on this occasion, not on the previous occasion. I apologize for that error. And Washington, realizing that something bad has really happened, goes back to Fort Necessity. And there, the French have sent a force which then indeed forces him to surrender. He had lost about 1/3 of his troops trying to defend that palisade, but it was very clear that they were all going to get killed if he didn't surrender. He was given what's called the honors of war. Now, I've talked about this before, just to emphasize, in European fighting, if you're under siege and you show resistance that is considered an honorable resistance, then you're allowed to surrender, march out with your troops, march out, not just walk out, bringing your flags, and often you could bring one artillery piece with you. And then you would return to your place of origin. So in this situation, the French are going to give him the honors of war, but he has to sign a surrender document. And like looking at Jumonville's document, he looks at it and he says, oh, I don't quite know what this means. This is in French. Big surprise. The translation goes badly, but it's also very clear that Washington really has no choice. So when he signs it unknowingly to him, it's certainly understandable from the French perspective, Washington admits responsibility for the killing of Jumonville, which was to come as an envoy from the French government. You're not supposed to kill envoys. But because of the circumstances under which the fighting took place, that transformed the nature of what happened. So the French made him admit that he had done this. So what happens then? Well, they destroy Fort Necessity. They also go off and destroy a number of trading posts in the area, and they go back to Fort Duquesne, which is where Pittsburgh is now, and they build that fort up to a major spot, even though the French, as I've said before, never commit the kind of resources to the French colonies in North America that the British have. So now the word gets back when Washington returns to Virginia, and the governor, Dinwiddie, looks at this and says, this is not good. And as a result, he sends word to England, and he says, the frontier is aflame. The French are on the march. They're going to destroy what we hold at the perimeter. And if we don't resist, then I cannot be held responsible for the catastrophe that is going to result. And I'm paraphrasing. Well, of course, the British government looks at that and says, those damn Americans can't fight worth anything, because he didn't have regular troops with him. Washington, he had militia and he had Native Americans. So they're just worthless. And if you're going to confront the French, which he did, confront regular French troops, not French militia, regular French troops, then we have to respond in kind. And if we're going to do that, I need an experienced general to go to North America and take charge. He will become the military commander-in-chief of all the colonies. The governors will have to listen to his orders, and the colonies, through the governor, will have to support the military campaigns that this general is going to set up. So they find a very experienced general, Braddock, and they send him over. Braddock had a lot of combat experience and a lot of logistic experience, which, remember, as I showed you the terrain features, made everything that happened in North America extremely difficult. You don't have the road system you have in Europe, right? It just doesn't exist. You can use the rivers, but that limits you to valley regions, and how do you get from this river to that river if there's a mountain in between? You have to deal with that. On top of it, in upstate New York is this guy, William Johnson. Now, William Johnson becomes basically the chief of Indian affairs, dealing primarily with the Iroquois nation. But he has great credit with them that he's built up over many years, a great deal of trust that they put in him. But as this conflict escalates, it's going to cause serious fracture tensions within the Iroquois nation. Now, the instructions basically that are given to Braddock initially are get the French out of the Ohio Valley, all right, get up to the forks, as it's called, the Monongahela, Allegheny, Ohio River connection, and to go up along Lake Champlain and destroy the French forts that are there, that are beginning to push the English boundaries south, because the British did not have a strong presence up there. You're to go on and do that, and finally kick the French out of Nova Scotia entirely. Get them out of there. We've had enough of this nonsense. We've given Louisbourg back too many times to count, and it's time to make the French pay big time. So Braddock establishes a real plan of campaign. He's got 4 different initiatives that he's thinking about. The first major one, which he is going to command himself, is to go up following that path. Fort Necessity's been destroyed, but they're going to rebuild it. To follow up to the Allegheny, Monongahela forks and take Fort Duquesne. And then, if he's successful, which he fully expects to be, because he's given a decent force to do this, to drive up to Lake Ontario and clear the French out of that region. Now, there's going to be another initiative, which is going to go up from the Albany region, and it's going to head west on the Mohawk River, roughly, that valley region, and then turn north to go up to what we call modern Oswego, establish a fort, and destroy the French fort, Fort Frontenac, that has been built at that part on the origin of the St. Lawrence River. And he's going to have another force, which is going to go straight north from Albany, up past what we call Lake George, up to Lake Champlain, and up there, and you can go see it. The ruins are there, not Fort Ticonderoga, right? Doesn't happen yet. It's Fort Frederick. It's on the west side of Lake Champlain, about 20 miles up from the southern end. And then there's another force, which he's going to send up to take Nova Scotia, with the job to take Louisbourg and get the French out of there once and for all. Pretty amazing undertaking when you think about it. Think of the logistical complexities that are involved in mustering enough force, equipment, and personnel, both combat and logistical support, to run these kinds of campaigns. But he's an experienced guy. He has to literally argue constantly with the colonial governors and their legislatures to gather the supplies. So there's quite a delay before he actually is able to do this. He arrives a year before, 1754, and he's finally getting things underway. Now, the other part to keep in mind And it goes back to the terrain. Each of these four has no way of assisting the other. There are four different forces, four different targets. No way, if one runs into trouble, that you can provide assistance. Now, the idea behind doing this is to spread the French so that they don't have the resources to confront each with any great power. So Braddock is counting on this sort of divide and conquer, but at the same time, he's taking great risk because any one of these could be defeated by itself if the French muster enough resource. And if you're the French and you get wind of this plan, which actually turns out to be the case, then you're in a world of hurt because they can figure out where the greatest threats are and figure out what they're going to do about it. Here's one of the important elements, and I'll finish with this because it gives you a sense of just how complicated things are. Braddock has to carve a road. Now, remember, when Washington went up there, he could follow a path, a track, because they're only himself and a few of the other people he's taking with him. He doesn't have a big wagon train or anything of the nature. In fact, if he's going to carry supplies, he's probably going to use mules and things of that nature. So Braddock now, by putting together a major force with wagons and artillery, because he's going to go up to Fort Duquesne and he has to subdue it. And the French have been increasing its defensive structure, so you need artillery to take that down. Means he has to cut a road. That means he's got to have people with axes, the ability to take down trees, get them out of the way, level the ground sufficiently that his wagons can move, right? You can't leave a 3-foot stump in the middle of your road. You're not going to get around it. So he has to do that. And that takes a long time as he works his way up. And every day that it takes him is one day more the French can build their defenses and prepare for his arrival. Okay? Just as an example, because they know he's coming. In addition, when you do this, when you're sending people out to cut down trees, how do you protect them? You have to send forces out to range across the front and on the flanks in order to prevent an ambush, which will kill a lot of people. So you have to do that as part of your movement. And that slows you down because you've got to organize them, give orders, send them out, tell them how far to go, work your way up, and then get them all to come back at a certain time, and so on and so forth. That's where generalship gets to be very complicated, the nuts and bolts of what you're going to do. The French say he's too far away for us to fuss with, right? Let him come. Hopefully we'll be prepared. We're working hard to be prepared. But there's no reason for us to go out any great distance other than to monitor his progress. And then we can tell how fast and how much time we have to prepare. And he's going maybe a mile or two a day, May through July, okay? Washington goes with him because he's been in there before, right? Notice who else is with him. Horatio Gates, Daniel Boone, Daniel Morgan. These names will show up later. There are 2,400, 2 British regulars, artillery. But notice what else he had. Carpenters. He has to bring a forge so he can repair things that break, because things are going to break. He has to have people who know how to handle leather and things of this sort. Think of just the food. 7,500 meals a day, if we just think of it as 3 meals a day. You're not going to get that by foraging on this trail. okay? Not going to happen. Anywhere from 1 to 4 miles. Why 1 mile? You come to a big stream or a small river. You got to get across it. Well, the wagons aren't just going to get dry. You have to know how deep it is. You have to understand the current. You have to look at the bed. If you bring 10 wagons across the same spot of a river crossing, you're going to dig up the ground, and sure enough, so one of your wagons are going to get stuck, maybe even get floated away if you're not careful. So you have to prepare, and that takes time and energy. He's got the flankers out to avoid a surprise attack, and then as they encounter more and more, that slows the rate of advance because the dangers are building up. Now, as he approaches Fort Duquesne, he reverts back, as is very reasonable, into the European structure. You have an advance guard, you have the main body, which also contains all of your logistical support, and you have a small rear guard so nobody can ambush you from behind, and you've got a few flankers out to make sure nothing is happening on the flank. But as he gets very close to Fort Duquesne, he doesn't use the flankers as readily. He crosses the Monongahela. He's moving along its northeastern bank. There's mountains on this side, hills, and on this side is the river. So I don't have to worry about the river. You know, they got to come down in canoes if they want to attach me there. I'll see them coming. That won't be a problem. The French commander at Fort Duquesne says, if I wait any longer, he'll set up a siege. And if he has the logistical support, which an experienced British commander almost certainly has, he can win this siege. So what do I do? Maybe if I catch him unawares, before he can establish a siege, I can defeat him, even though my numbers are smaller. Okay, because the French just aren't putting the resources in as far as this goes. So what happens is that Contrecoeur, the other heart, it's an interesting translation, decides that he's going to go out and he's going to ambush Braddock. So what happens? Here's the Monongahela River. Braddock has crossed. He's got his advance guard, main body, and rear guard. And the Native Americans and French soldiers attack from the side and from the front. They attack from the front to hold these guys in place, make them stop, make them confront what they see in front of them. But meanwhile, the major attack is coming from both flanks. Why? Because Braddock's trail had deviated from the Monongahela in order to go up following an Indian path towards Fort Duquesne. They're caught there and they're ambushed, and it is an utter disaster. The advance guard takes the major hit. That's what they're supposed to do, except that they lose some officers and they rout. Discipline collapses. And it's important to remember one of the other things that is very true in warfare up until the most modern era. When you have knowledge that your enemy, if he captures you, will torture you, that he'll mutilate your body, and you hear screaming, and these people in war paint, and there's smoke and confusion everywhere where you can't see more than a couple of yards. And things are happening to people around you, getting killed or wounded, whatever, disappearing into the underbrush. Pretty soon, without officers, This is, I'm out of here time. So they lose discipline and they fall back on the main body. But unfortunately, as they come back on the main body, they immediately start to disrupt what Braddock is trying to establish as a concerted defensive line to hold off the attack. It completely blows everything up. And again, they get attacked from the flank. And when they're attacked from the flank, Braddock is mortally wounded. He doesn't die immediately, but he is out of it. And while leadership falls down, you have to remember, in the confusion of battle, Braddock is hit. Off he goes. You got to find the guy who's in command. You have to let everybody know he's in command. And in all this confusion, for that guy to be able to exert his influence becomes very, very unlikely. So as that happens, now you're falling back on your wagon train, you're falling back on people who are just carpenters, smiths. These are not combat soldiers. And they see people panicking, especially soldiers. What's their response? I'm out of here. I'm leaving. So pretty soon this whole thing collapses and only the rear guard remains some level of discipline and control as everybody rushes past them. This gives you an example of the kind of fighting that's taking place. Native Americans, French militia, you don't see the French soldiers except back up here, but look down into where they're trapped. And that's just some of the smoke. If any of you have experience with black powder, you'll realize just how dense that can be. And now you've got 100 guns shooting from a relatively small area, and it becomes very difficult. Plus it's forest, so it doesn't dissipate quickly. The French losses are relatively minor in comparison. Not insignificant, but 800 British out of a 2,500 force. Okay, pretty bad, all right? The Indians take prisoners, loot, and then, like most times, as will happen during the French and Indian War, see ya, I'm going home. I survived the battle, I've got loot, I've got trophies, maybe scalps. I can go back and show my people I am a great warrior, because that's the ethos. The French return. I just like this because the victorious warrior tries on a coat he just took from one of the fallen British after Braddock's defeat. Again, that's because that's your trophy. Look what I did, look what I have. This improves your prestige considerably. What about the other campaigns? Well, one is occurring, as I mentioned, all the way up towards Fort Oswego. The other heads up towards Crown Point, which is where the main French route is. And then there's the one to Louisburg. This one going up towards Fort Carillon. We're gonna back up, and I'm gonna stop in just a moment because I want to pick this thread up later in the next lecture. Is initially able to make its way by establishing forts at Fort Edward and then a camp where they're going to build Fort William Henry. Now, I show this to you for the following reason. If you watch the movie The Last of the Mohicans, there's a whole scene of what takes place when Montcalm shows up with French and Indian forces to besiege Fort William Henry. So I'm going to stop here because I think this is plenty to try to digest in one day. And I appreciate your tolerance for all of this. Certainly if you have any questions or comments, happy to hear them. Yes?
Mike, why is it that the Brits have the best ships, the most ships?
Okay. the question is, why did the British have the largest number of ships and likely the best, at least in constructed and certainly crewed, that is, the crews that handle those ships? It's a difficult one to answer, but it goes back probably at least 2 centuries, if not longer. Being an island nation, their primary concerns were trade, and how do you protect your trade routes? How do you prevent another continentally based nation like Spain or France, because the Holy Roman Empire is disorganized? How do you prevent an invasion? Remember the Spanish Armada? You've heard that word. An attempt by Spain to invade England, beaten off by Drake, and the Spanish Armada got caught in a bad storm and lost nearly all of its people before a few remnants get back to Spain. And then the French at different times had built up forces which could be threatening, but never could quite muster bringing it all to bear. So in terms of military capacity, the British needed, from their perspective, the best possible ships that could be made, and they had to have the best trained crews, and they're motivated by protection of the homeland, and when you're out there, and you often did this through centuries, raiding other nations' merchant ships, when you captured that, it became what's called a prize. And if you could bring it back intact to England, it would be sold, its contents sold, and the captain and every crewman would get a certain percentage of the money that that brought in. So that meant you were willing to take on challenges because merchantmen were not necessarily unarmed. Okay, so you had to be combat ready and worthy and aggressive enough and smart enough tactically. These are sailing ships, to know how to take advantage so you could gain that prize. And there are many stories about how Spanish treasure ships were intercepted and captured. And of course, the treasure is now England's, you see. Back then, they weren't pirates because they were given something called a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, which was a document given to them by the crown that said you are a surrogate of the crown. You're not a pirate. And therefore, if for some reason you're defeated, you are given the same protections you would give to any military organization. So that's a long answer to your question. Yes.
So the launching of Braddock's expedition required the crown be behind it.
Yes.
Which George was that?
George II.
George II.
Yep.
And so that all had to be planned and approved in London before Braddock could do anything, right?
No. Braddock was given certain vague goals. The British crown was smart enough not to micromanage. What they wanted was somebody with experience. It's not clear to me that he had to get in touch with the crown and say, are these 4 expeditions okay with you? I don't have access to what correspondence may have gone on there. From what I have seen, he did his own planning because he was put in charge as the military chief. So you figure it out. These are the goals. You go take care of it.
How long did it take for a message to get from Braddock to George and back?
It would take at least 12 weeks in good weather. And in bad weather, it would take much longer because you wouldn't sail during certain times. So think about that. You can wait 3 months to get a message of approval. In the meantime, what do? Well, you have to gather up all of your resources and planning and training and everything else that goes along with it, because you can't afford to let that time slide. And by the time a message arrives, what if they said, don't do it? And you're thinking, oh, jeez. I had to coerce this legislature into giving us this and recruiting people. You know, give me a break. Other questions? All right, I'm gonna do something right now, and then I'm done. You can turn it off. Okay.